Good morning, class. Hey, it's Mr. Stewart, and this is going to be your integrity instructional component for chapters 1 and 2. What you should be seeing is hopefully me in a small picture on your screen, and then you should be seeing the PowerPoint. When you view this, if that's not what you see, if you can't see me as well as the PowerPoint, or at least see the PowerPoint and hear me, then please send me a message and let me know. I'm not going to be going straight through this chapter because, as I stated in the orientation, you guys have to read the chapters. And because we don't have any formal class meetings, I'm not just going to go straight through this material the same way you could if you can read the chapter. I mean, in an online class, you guys have to read. So with that being said, I'm going to hit some of the high points in chapters 1 or 2 and bring a couple of things to your attention. I'm probably going to be moving through some of these slides fairly quickly. So you have these PowerPoint presentations under the Week 1 Learning Modules tab here in the course. So I just want to kind of give you an overview and bring your attention to a couple things here in chapters 1 and 2. Again, this is Introduction to Corrections. We are using the American Corrections textbook by the author Clear, and hopefully most of you have obtained that textbook at this point. If you haven't, you need to get it. There's no ebook. I'm not using ebooks any longer. However, if you go through www.half.com or Chegg or one of the online book companies, you can probably get it much cheaper than you can at the bookstore, and you can probably even rent the textbook or even rent an electronic copy of the textbook fairly cheaply. So with that being said, you need to make sure you get the book because you're going to have to read these chapters. Okay. Can't get my slides to advance. There we go. You can see here on the PowerPoint here we've got some learning objectives. Those are probably the same that you see in the learning modules in the textbook. I'm not going to go through all of those. You need to read those because by the time you get through reading chapter 1 and thinking about chapter 1, you should be able to do these things. Chapter 1 really is kind of an overview in regard to corrections, and what it does, it kind of gives you an idea of kind of what the corrections picture looks like here in the United States. At the time this textbook was written, and this textbook is not that old of a textbook. I mean, it's been around for a couple editions. It's 2013, so these statistics are about as recent as a statistic that you can get. Understand that statistics are usually several years behind the 8 ball, so to speak, because it takes a while to compile and analyze all those statistics in order for it to be meaningful to us. So when you see in 2015, if you see something from 2008 through 2010 or 11, that's going to be considered fairly recent. So I just want you to understand that. You can see here what the U.S. imprisonment rate is: 506 people for every 100,000 people in the country. Many people think that the U.S. has far more people in prison than many other countries do. That's just not the case. We actually have lower crime rates and lower incarceration rates than a lot of other countries do. So I just want you to understand, we're not an anomaly. We are within what I would consider to be normal guidelines, if you will, or kind of normal boundaries of how many people we incarcerate per 100,000 people. You can see there's 3,200 people on death row, 14,000 people serving life sentences. If you think about that in relation to about how many murders happen in the United States every year, that's still not a large or a very high statistic. I mean, 15,000 murders typically every single year in the United States. So you know that not every one of those people are receiving a life sentence or a death sentence. So therefore, our punishment is probably not actually as bad as what a lot of people tend to think it is. Considering all forms of correction, more than 3% of all adults are under some form of correctional control. Now, when they say some form of correctional control, what we're talking about here is It could be community corrections. It could be parole. It could be probation. It could be actually incarcerated somewhere. Basically, if you've been through the criminal justice system, you have received a punishment, a sentence of some sort, and you're under some sort of control or have to meet some sort of guidelines in order not to go back to jail, then you are considered to be under correctional control. We also know that there's not a lot of relationship between the prison population and the crime rate. Honestly, it doesn't matter how many people we lock up. That doesn't necessarily affect the crime rate. Now, what does affect the crime rate is aggressive law enforcement. When we do arrest and prosecute more people, we know that that has an effect on the crime rate, that it typically can lower that crime rate in a statistically significant manner, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the more people we send to prison affects that crime rate. It doesn't. So honestly, if we're out there arresting more people and sentencing them to some type of punishment, it doesn't necessarily have to be prison. It could be probation, parole, and in fact, you're going to see a graph in a minute. The greatest majority of people under correctional control are not in prison. They're on probation. So let's talk about this first learning objective just a minute. The range of purposes served by the correctional system. You know, most people think that corrections is and they think it's a misnomer because all they see is punishment, because TV, books, movies have led us to believe that prison is a terrible, terrible place and it's all punishment, that we don't do anything to do any rehabilitation. Well, some prisons are punishment oriented, and as a general rule, the adult criminal justice system in the United States is punishment oriented. There's been a resurgence in rehabilitation efforts in the last couple decades where we're actually putting more money and effort toward rehabilitating prisoners, and many states have the extra funding available that they can actually do some rehabilitation of the adult prisoners. But one of the main purposes of corrections is we have to protect society from the worst of the worst. There are some people that are not going to live by our rules, and we have to lock them up. We have to put them somewhere where, number one, they can't hurt others, and number two, they can't hurt other people in society. So not only do we have to protect society, but we have to protect other people from them and even protect them from themselves. So one of the main goals of corrections is protecting society from those who can't play well with others. Prison is also supposed to define the limits of behavior so everyone understands what is permissible. In other words, it sets an example. If you don't live by the rules, you get sent to prison. Here are the rules. Live by the rules. And if you cannot do that, then you will be charged with a crime. You may be convicted, and if you are convicted, you may be punished by being incarcerated somewhere. One of the central purposes of corrections is to carry out whatever the sentence that is handed down by the courts. Prisons, for the most part, do not have any say, if you will, on what the sentence is. There's only one or two states where the Department of Correction is given some much more bolder authority. But as a general rule here in the United States, law enforcement, which is part of the executive branch, enforces the law. We bring people to court. It's the court's job to determine if that person is guilty or not guilty. We do not find people innocent in the United States. We just don't. We either prove them guilty or we don't. If we prove you guilty, then it's up to the court then to determine an appropriate sentence for that particular lawbreaker. It could be probation, it could be only a fine, it could be incarceration, jail, prison, or whatnot. So once the court has determined an appropriate sentence, and if that sentence contains prison, then you're handed back to the executive branch, which is what corrections falls under, to carry out that sentence. They don't have any say as to what the sentence is. They're simply enforcing the sentence that's been handed down by the courts. It's what we call a bifurcated system, which means it splits. You've got the actual determination of guilt handled by one branch of government, and then you've got the enforcement of of the law and the enforcement of the sentence handled by another branch of government, so that there's not too much power under one of those branches, because if it is, that would breed corruption. Hopefully you guys can understand that. All right, let's move on. Here's a graph I was telling you about. You can see that 2.8% of all those people who enter the criminal justice system are in federal prison. 10% are in county jails. 11% are paroled out of prison. 18% are in state prison, but a whopping almost 58% of all of those people, so over half of everybody that enters the criminal justice system is in probation, which means they never see prison. They may have seen a county jail for a very short period of time, then they go to trial, and then they get found guilty, and instead of going to prison, they're sentenced to probation. And probation is simply a set of rules and guidelines that person must follow in order to stay out of jail. And if they violate those rules or regulations, then they can actually be sent to prison. But and we'll be talking about that a little bit more later in the term. But I just want you to understand the greatest majority of those in the criminal justice system are not in prison. So this particular class is not just about prison, but it's about corrections in general. How do we deal with the guilty lawbreaker? You can see Learning Objective 2 there, define the systems framework, explain why it's useful. You guys can read that. That's pretty straightforward. I'm not going to necessarily go through that. It does talk about the goals of the system. The two main goals of corrections are punishment and protection. We already talked about that just a minute. There is a bit of interconnectedness between corrections and the courts and law enforcement, because think about the criminal justice system almost as an assembly line, or maybe an interstate that connects one city to another, but yet you could get off of that interstate at an exit and you can get back on going the other way, or you can get back on going the same way. And that's really how the criminal justice system works. And I think you'll understand more of that the more you read in this particular chapter. All right. I'm going to move through some of these slides here and talk about a couple things just a minute before I move on to chapter 2. Like I said, you're going to have to get into this chapter. You're going to have to read it in order to understand kind of the corrections picture, what it's like today. Let's talk about the various components. Basically, you're going to see that there are subunits within the corrections system. You're going to have probation officers. You're going to have halfway houses. And what a halfway house is basically someplace that a prisoner sleeps at night. It may be considered a secure or a fairly secure facility, but they're typically let out in the morning and the daytime to go to work. And then you've got actual prisons, which are completely secure, which hopefully nobody leaves from without permission. That's what we hope anyway. Also understand that we have every state has a state system of corrections, and then we have a federal system of corrections. And this is what we call federalism. That's when the power and responsibilities are divided between the federal government and state governments. Every single state in this country, including Washington, D.C., has their own corrections department. They run their own prisons. They may be federally governed to a certain degree, but they pretty well do what they want to do. Each state does what they want to do with their own prison system. And then you have the federal prison system, which is independent of that. They fall under the Department of Justice. And basically they only incarcerate prisoners who violate federal law and have been found guilty of violating a federal law. Whereas in the state system, you're found guilty of violating an offense within that state. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Yeah, and this is absolutely true. Most correctional activity takes place at the state level. There are far more state institutions and far more people incarcerated at the state level than there is at the federal level, because there are really not that many federal crimes. It's a very narrow window of offenses in which you will be actually sentenced to federal prison for. It's much more likely you would be sentenced to state prison than you would federal prison for sure. This talks about the differences between prisons and jails. Make sure you read that section in the textbook that you understand that. Jails are typically for two types of prisoners. One is those that have not yet been convicted of an offense but are being held either because they cannot make bail or because they are a danger to themselves or the community. Prisons are reserved for those people who have been convicted of more serious crimes, felonies. We don't sentence people to prison for being convicted of a misdemeanor, only for felonies. And also prisons do not hold people who are waiting to go to trial unless they have been previously convicted of something else. So prisons are, for much more serious crimes, they're much more secure facilities typically than most county jails are. This next learning objectives asks us to identify at least 5 key issues facing corrections today. And we're going to be talking about some of this in discussions, but I think it's important that you read this, is that there are conflicting goals. Some people don't think prisoners can be rehabilitated. Some people think they simply need to be warehoused, if you will, to get them away from everybody else. So not everybody always agrees on that. There's also competition with funding. Funding is a key issue. I would ask that you may even look up here in Alabama some of the issues with the correctional funding. I think the state legislature just passed a correctional reform bill because Alabama's prisons are chronically overcrowded. They don't have enough money to run the system the way the system's supposed to be ran, and they're trying to figure out what to do. So funding is almost always an issue. And unfortunately, when you have a large system, you have bureaucracies. And typically with bureaucracies, there's duplication of effort, there is inefficiency. Anytime you have a large government agency, there's issues with the system running smoothly. Not everybody, left hand doesn't always know what right hand is doing. Unfortunately, that's just kind of the way it works. Another issue is coordinating correctional activity across different agencies. Everybody wants to do their own thing, and sometimes they don't always play well together. This has always been an issue, probably always will be an issue, although it does seem to be getting better. And then one of the last issues is dealing with correctional uncertainty. It's impossible to predict how individual choice will impact the system. And I think you just need to read that section in your textbook, and if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer questions either through email, course messages, via phone in my office, or even in the discussion boards as well. So I'm not going to get into real in depth about those conflicting goals. I want you to read that. I want you to contemplate on that. The funding, the bureaucracy, the coordination, the uncertainty, etc. Let's see. Yeah, read this section in your textbook about the great experiment on corrections as well. The great experiment of social control, because corrections is supposed to be social control. Knowing that you could be sent to prison if you violate the law should act as a deterrent for many people not to violate the law. I mean, I don't know about you guys. I've worked in a prison, but I don't want to live there. I don't want to be sent to prison to live out, several years or the remainder of my life. So therefore, I don't go out and remove people from the gene pool or rob banks or do any manner of things that could get me sent to prison. I mean, although I've never been to prison, I don't want to live there. It's not a pleasant place. So it does act as a type of social control for many of us. For the typical law-abiding citizen who may contemplate breaking the law from time to time, it's not a way of our life, but we may think about breaking the law from time to time. We've all had things that we that we wanted to do, or people we wanted to remove from the gene pool. And what kept us from doing it? Well, number one, we know it's wrong, and number two, we don't want to go to prison, or we don't want to get the electric chair, or we don't want to ride the lightning, or be put to sleep with like an animal at the vet. So with that being said, prison does act as an agent of social control for us to a certain degree. Now, your professional criminals, your more serious criminals, they don't think about prison. Or if they do, they don't think that it's anything really to worry about. In fact, many times, some of those criminals would rather be in prison than not. Because in prison, you get 3 hots and a cot, cable TV, ball field. You only have to work 6 hours a day, and the work's not that difficult. So, many people look at prison as, hey, this is better than my life out on the street. They like the structured environment because out in the world is chaos. It simply is. So some people do want to go to prison, and it's unfortunate that our society is that way, that some people would rather be in prison than not. But those people, it's not an agent of social control for them. In fact, it's simply just another alternative for whatever their decision or bad decision making is. So read that section about the Great Experiment. All right, that in essence is chapter 1. And I want to talk for just a minute here about chapter 2. As soon as I get my PowerPoint to load here. Chapter 2 talks about the history of correctional thought and practice. And one of the things, I'm just going to spend a minute talking about basically kind of the history of corrections in the United States. Now, this chapter will go in the history of corrections in general, but we typically have had kind of 2 schools of thought about corrections here in the United States. And you can go through this PowerPoint, you can read this chapter, but early in our history, corrections was kind of haphazard. We just did it however we thought would work. We put people on old slave ships. We put people in caves. We repurposed buildings that were already worn out or been used for something else and made them into prisons. But it really wasn't until the first quarter century in the 1800s that we began to really seriously contemplate how we would go about imprisoning people. And there were 2 schools of thought. And it's based on 2 styles of prison architecture, actually. The first style is going to be what we call the Pennsylvania system, and then the second style is called the New York system, or the Auburn system. Now, the Pennsylvania system was interesting because it was kind of one of those things where, all right, we're going to put each prisoner in a cell all by themselves. It's going to be large enough that they can do a job in their cell. They're not going to get out of their cell. We're going to feed them there. They're going to go to the bathroom there. They're going to work there, and they're not going to get to talk to anybody else, because kind of the Quakers who were prominent in Pennsylvania, late 1700s, early 1800s, believed that, hey, these people need to reflect on what they've done. They need penance. They need to pay penance. They need to be penitent, if you will. Hence the term penitentiary is based on the term being penitent, which means you need to reflect on what you did, know it was wrong, and try to make a determination that how can I correct my behavior. But it was very expensive because you had a lot of square footage for every single prisoner. And there were a couple prisons built using this style of architecture. At about the same time, in Auburn, New York, they built a new prison. And this prison basically went to very small cells. And the prisoners only slept there. And they had a bucket to use the bathroom in. But they got out in the daytime to do a job. And they went to a common area to eat, a chow hall, cafeteria, if you will. And they worked outside of the cell. The only time they were put in their cells was just to sleep, basically. And they could put many more prisoners in the same square footage using the Auburn or New York system than they could using the Pennsylvania system. And this is completely about simple economics. or money? How can we house the most prisoners for the least amount of money possible? And corrections was a business then, and it's a business now. It's still about simple economics. How can we get the most bang for our buck, if you will? And if you keep that in mind as you read this early history of correctional thought and practice, I think you'll understand it a little bit better. I'm about to run out of battery power here, so I'm going to stop this particular integrity class, and if you have questions, please reach out, read these 2 chapters, answer discussion postings, and I'll see you in discussions. Bye-bye.